The dust did not care who she was. It settled on her shoulders the same as it settled on the fence post she was meant to be tied to, a fine, indifferent grit that coated the back of her tongue. Her name was Alara, but that name had become a ghost in her own mouth, a word owned by a dead man and now discarded by his living brother. Silas had left her at the edge of town, just past the last lean-to shack where the washerwoman lived. He had not used rope. He had used words which were stronger. He had declared her unburdened. Unburdened of a home, of a name, of a future. He had called it a kindness. The town watched. They stood in the doorways of the mercantile and the saloon, faces like smudged glass, mouths drawn in thin, straight lines of pity or judgment. She could not tell the difference. They were a single, many-eyed creature, and its gaze was a weight. She felt it on the frayed collar of her dress, on the crack in her worn leather shoes. She had stood there for an hour, maybe more. The sun was a hammer in the brassy sky. The wind lifted strands of her hair, heavy with dust, and let them fall. She did not cry. The well inside her had gone dry long ago, sometime during her husband's long sickness. All that was left was a deep, hollow echo. Silas's wagon was a small, dark speck shrinking into the horizon. With it went the smell of the pinewood house she had scrubbed, the feel of the quilt she had stitched, the memory of a life that had belonged to someone else. She was a slate wiped clean by a rough, dirty hand. Finally, the watching eyes grew bored. Doors closed. The street emptied, leaving only her and the uncaring sun and the whispers of the wind. She turned her back on the town, on the life that had cast her out, and walked. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. The land opened up, raw and unforgiving. The gentle green of the valley gave way to cracked earth and sentinel rocks that looked like bones bleaching in the sun. The wind turned mean, pushing against her, trying to force her back toward the town that did not want her. She leaned into it, a small, stubborn thing against the vastness. Her feet found a path that was not a path, a game trail that wound its way higher into the broken hills. She walked until the sun began to bleed a blood-orange stain across the western sky. Thirst was a fire in her throat. Every muscle ached with a weariness that went deeper than bone. It was the weariness of the soul. It was the carrion birds that she saw first, circling low against the bruised purple of dusk. A dark vortex in the sky. Instinct, a thing she had forgotten she possessed, pulled her forward. Something was dying, or was already dead, felt fitting. She found him in a shallow ravine, half hidden by a scrub of mesquite. He was Apache. His clothes were buckskin, dark with what she first thought was shadow, but then knew was blood. He lay on his side, unnaturally still, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that was not there. A rifle lay a few feet from his hand, its wood stock split. Her first thought was to run. The stories told in town were of ghosts and shadows, of men who moved without sound and fought with the fury of cornered wolves. He was the enemy. He was the reason men like her husband and Silas carried rifles even when they went to check their own fence lines. She took a step back, her heel dislodging a cascade of small pebbles. The sound was a gunshot in the immense quiet. He moved, a bare, almost imperceptible shift of his head. His eyes opened. They were dark, bottomless, and filled with a pain so vast it seemed to swallow the last of the light. He was not a ghost. He was a man, and he was dying. The town had left her to die. Silas had left her to die. The world had looked at her and found her wanting. She looked at this man, this stranger, this enemy, and saw a reflection. Two people discarded by the living. She took a hesitant step forward. His eyes tracked her, but there was no threat in them, only a raw, burning agony. A deep gash ran from his shoulder down his side, a ragged tear in his flesh. The blood was dark and crusted in some places, still sluggishly seeping in others. She knelt. The dust puffed up around her knees. Her shadow fell across his face, and he flinched, a low sound escaping his throat, a noise like stones grinding together. "Water," she whispered, the words scraping her own dry throat. She had none. Her canteen, a gift from her father, was back at the house. Silas had probably already claimed it. She stood and looked around, her gaze frantic. There, a darker line of vegetation snaking along the base of the hills. A dry wash, but where there was a wash there might be a seep. Hope was a fragile, unfamiliar thing, but it made her move. She found it, a small, muddy pool of water, barely a handful, shielded by a rock. She cupped her hands, the cool dampness a shock to her skin. She carried it back to him, precious and leaking through her fingers. She knelt again, bringing her cupped hands to his lips. They were cracked and dry. He watched her, his dark eyes unwavering. For a long moment he did not move. Then, with a shuddering effort, he drank. The water ran down his chin, tracing a clean path through the grime and blood. She made 3 more trips before the light failed completely. She did not know what to do about the wound. She had no cloth, no medicine. She had only her 2 hands and a silence that felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was a shared space. As true darkness fell, bringing a chill that bit deep, she knew she could not leave him. The coyotes were beginning to sing their sharp, lonely songs in the distance. She looked at his still form, then at the shallow overhang of rock a few yards away. It was not a cave, but it was shelter. "We have to move," she said, her voice thin in the open air. He did not seem to understand the words, but he understood the intent in her tone. Getting him there was a nightmare of small, agonizing movements. She put her shoulder under his good one, taking his weight. He was heavier than he looked, a dead, solid weight of muscle and bone. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath each time they shifted, but he did not cry out. He moved with her, his one good leg pushing, his good arm bracing. They collapsed under the rock overhang, a tangle of limbs and exhaustion. The rock cut the wind, and the space felt impossibly safe. She sat with her back against the stone, her own breathing ragged. He lay beside her, his breath a low, rasping rhythm in the dark. She did not sleep. She listened to him breathe, listened to the night sounds, and felt a strange, fierce resolve hardening inside her. She had been left with nothing, but now she had this, a life to guard, purpose. It was a terrible, fragile thing, but it was hers. The sun rose, painting the rock face in shades of rose and gold. He was still alive. His fever was high. She could feel the heat radiating from him. His skin was dry to the touch. The wound on his side looked angry, the edges swollen and red. She knew she had to clean it. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her dress. The sound of the tearing fabric was violent. It was the last piece of her old life, and she sacrificed it without a second thought. She used the cloth to bring more water, to gently, painstakingly wash away the dirt and dried blood from his skin. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white where he gripped a handful of sand, but he let her do it. For days they existed in that small pocket of the world. Time became a rhythm of tasks. Find water. Find herbs she recognized from her mother's teachings. Yarrow to pack into the wound, willow bark to chew for the fever. She learned the landscape out of necessity. Which rocks held the warmth of the sun longest. Where the lizards skittered. Which way the wind would blow before a storm. He drifted in and out of consciousness. In his fever dreams, he spoke in his own tongue. The words a low, guttural river of sound she did not understand but could feel the pain in. During those times, she would place a cool, damp cloth on his forehead and hum. A nameless tune, a simple, repetitive melody that seemed to soothe the frantic energy in the small shelter. One afternoon, when the sun was high and hot, he was lucid. He watched her crush herbs between 2 flat stones. His gaze was clear, the fever having receded for a time. He reached for the knife at his belt, a fluid motion that startled her. She froze, the stone heavy in her hand. He did not point it at her. With slow, deliberate movements, he sliced a thin, strong strip of leather from the bottom of his own tunic. He held it out to her. His meaning was clear. For her water gathering, a strap for her makeshift container. It was the first exchange, the first gift. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was cool. The fever was breaking. She gave a small, jerky nod of thanks, her throat too tight to speak. He closed his eyes again, exhausted by the effort, but a line of tension in his jaw had eased. They stitched their new life together with these raw threads of unspoken kindness. She would return with a handful of bitter roots, and he would have sharpened a stick for her to dig with. She would arrange stones to better block the wind, and he would use his one good arm to drag a piece of fallen wood closer for the small fire she dared to make only at night. The fire changed everything. It was a tiny spark of defiance against the vast, cold dark. They sat on either side of it, the flames dancing in their eyes. The silence between them was no longer an absence of words, but a presence. It was heavy and full, made of shared hardship and a fragile, growing trust. One evening, the flames casting long shadows on the rock wall, he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, like it came from under floorboards. Why? The English word was stark, clear. It hung in the air between them. Alara looked at him. His face was gaunt, but his eyes held a steady, waiting intelligence. She thought of Silas's back, of the closed doors of the town, of the crushing indifference of the world. She had no grand answer, only the simple, stark truth. She gestured from him to herself, a sweeping motion of her hand that encompassed their whole broken situation. No one else, she said, her voice just as rough. It was enough. He seemed to understand the universe of meaning in those two words. He gave a slow, solemn nod and turned his gaze back to the fire. He began to heal. The deep gash on his side was closing, knitting itself into a long, puckered scar. He could sit up for longer periods. He started to carve, using his knife on a piece of deadwood. The shavings fell at his feet, smelling of pine and earth. He carved the shape of a hawk, its wings outstretched. His strength returned in small increments. One day he stood, leaning heavily against the rock wall. The next he took a few faltering steps. Alara watched him, a fierce pride swelling in her chest. She had done this. She had kept death from this small shelter. His name, she learned, was Kale. He said it once, pointing to his chest. He then looked at her, a question in his eyes. Alara, she replied. The name felt strange and new on her tongue. It was not the name of a wife or a widow. It was her own. They were two people with names. The day he was able to walk to the seep for water himself was a turning point. He came back, his buckskin pouch dripping, and offered it to her first. She drank, watching him over the rim. The balance had shifted. They were no longer patient and protector. They were partners in this bare, stripped-down life. That night he added a new carving to the hawk. Below its talons, he etched a small, delicate flower, a desert bloom. He held it out for her to see. A hawk and a flower. Him and her. A few days later, the world intruded. Two riders appeared on the ridge to the east, their figures silhouetted against the morning sun. They were too far to see clearly, but their stillness was watchful, patient. They were not cowboys. They sat their horses with a fluid ease that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. Kale saw them, too. He went still, every line of his body tensing. He melted back into the shadows of the rock overhang, pulling her with him. His hand on her arm was not rough, but it was firm, urgent. My people, he said, his voice a low whisper. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the quiet calm she had built. His people. They would see her, a white woman, with one of their own wounded. They would not see the nights by the fire, the shared water, the unspoken pact of survival. They would see an enemy. The riders began to move down the ridge, their path leading directly toward the ravine. There was no escape. Kale gripped the handle of his knife. His face was a mask of grim resolve. He was still weak, in no shape to fight. Stay behind me, he ordered, his voice low and commanding. But she remembered the town, the watching eyes that did nothing. She remembered being left alone. She would not leave him alone now. As the two warriors rode into the ravine, their hard, searching eyes scanning the rocks, Alara made a choice. They saw the faint wisp of smoke from their dead fire. They dismounted, rifles held loosely but ready. They were tall men, their faces weathered and stern, their eyes missing nothing. They moved with a silent, predatory grace. When they saw Cale, a flicker of recognition, then relief, crossed their faces. But then they saw her, standing beside him, and their faces hardened into suspicion. Their eyes narrowed. One of them spoke to Cale in their own language, the words sharp and questioning. Cale answered, his voice weak but steady. But the men's gazes remained fixed on her, cold and assessing. One of them took a step forward, his hand tightening on his rifle. He saw Cale's wound, then looked at her as if she were the cause of it. In that moment, Alara understood. They believed she was his captor, or worse. They saw her as a threat, and Cale, in his weakened state, was vulnerable. Without thinking, she moved. She stepped directly in front of Cale, placing her own body between him and the approaching warrior. She held her hands out, palms open and empty, a gesture of peace that felt hopelessly small and inadequate. She was thin as a fence rail, wearing a ragged, torn dress, but she stood her ground, her chin lifted. She would not let them harm him. She had not saved him from death, only to lose him to a misunderstanding. The warrior stopped. His eyes widened in surprise. To see this small, pale woman shielding a wounded Apache warrior with her own body was something outside of his experience. It defied all logic. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Cale put his hand on her shoulder. A warm, steady pressure. "Nantan," he said to the warrior. It was a word of respect. Then he spoke again, a short, quiet sentence in their tongue. The warriors looked from Cale to Alara, their expressions shifting from suspicion to confusion, and then to a dawning, grudging respect. Then Cale spoke in English, his voice clear and strong for her to hear, for them to hear. "She is friend," he said. "She saved this life." The warrior lowered his rifle. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a white woman, not as an enemy, but as the person Cale claimed her to be. He gave a short, sharp nod. The danger had passed. It dissolved into the dry afternoon air, leaving Alara trembling, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. Cale's hand was still on her shoulder. It was the anchor that kept her from collapsing. They took them both back to their camp, a hidden settlement nestled in a high canyon, a place of cookfires and horse herds and the murmur of a language she did not know. The journey was a blur to Alara. She rode one of the warrior's horses, her mind still replaying the moment she had stood before the rifle. The camp, the workia, was a place of life. Children stared at her with wide, curious eyes. Women paused in their work, their dark eyes following her, their expressions unreadable. She was an outsider, a ghost from another world. Suspicion clung to her like wet paper. Cale was taken to a lodge to be tended to by a medicine woman, a figure of immense authority with eyes that seemed to see right through Alara's skin. Alara was left to sit by a fire, alone. She was given food, a flat, warm bread and a stew of rabbit and herbs. She ate because it was an offering, but she felt the weight of 100 watching eyes, a feeling she remembered all too well. Days passed. Cale recovered under the care of his people. Alara existed in a strange limbo. She was not a prisoner, but she was not free. She slept in a small lodge by herself, a space they had given her. She tried to help, to make herself useful, gathering firewood or fetching water, but the women would simply watch her, then take the task from her with a quiet finality. She was not one of them. It was Cale who broke the impasse. When he was strong enough to walk, he came to her lodge. He looked different now, cleaner, his hair braided with beads of turquoise. He still carried the stark lines of his ordeal on his face, but his strength was returning. He led her to the center of the camp, where the elders sat in council. The entire village seemed to gather, forming a wide, silent circle. This was a reckoning. Cale stood before the elders and he told the story. He spoke in his own language, but Alara did not need to understand the words. She understood the cadence of his voice, the way he gestured to the long, healing scar on his side. She heard the words for water and fever and fire. She watched as he reenacted the moment she had stepped in front of the warrior's rifle, shielding him. When he finished speaking, a deep silence fell over the camp. The head elder, a man whose face was a map of 100 hard seasons, rose to his feet. He was ancient, his eyes holding the wisdom of the stones themselves. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped before her and looked at her for a long time. His gaze was not hostile. It was deep and searching. He was weighing her soul. Then he spoke, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He did not speak to her, but to his people. He said a phrase, and it was repeated by the others, a soft chorus that rippled through the crowd. Kale came to her side. "He has given you a name," he said, his voice low. "Izinadai. It means, she who makes peace from a shield." He paused. "Mother of Peace." The name settled over her. It was not a brand or a dismissal. It was a cloak of honor, woven from her own actions. It was a home for her soul. In that moment, standing in the heart of the Apache camp, surrounded by people who had been her enemies, Alara was no longer the discarded woman from a town that had no name for her. She was Izinadai. Her rebirth was not yet complete. The past had one last ghost to send. A week later, Silas appeared at the mouth of the canyon. He was not alone. He had the town sheriff with him, a man with a tin star and a self-important swagger. Silas's face was a mask of sour righteousness. The gossip in town had turned against him. People were whispering that he had driven his brother's widow out to die. His reputation was at stake. He had come to reclaim her, to prove his own decency. "Alara," he called out, his voice thin and sharp in the vast space. "I've come to take you home." Home. The word was a bitter joke. Several Apache warriors, Kale among them, moved to block the entrance to the canyon. They stood, silent and imposing, a wall of buckskin and resolve. Alara walked toward them, her steps steady. She did not feel like the woman who had stood trembling in the dust. She felt the weight of her new name. "That's far enough, Silas," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. It carried across the distance between them. Silas's face contorted in disbelief. "Alara? What are you doing with these savages? They've captured you. We're here to rescue you." "I was not captured," she said. "I was saved. And I was not rescued. I was found." The sheriff shifted uneasily. "Ma'am, this ain't proper. You belong with your own folk." "My folk," Alara said, and she glanced back at Kale, at the stoic faces of the warriors beside him, at the women and children watching from the camp. "Are here." It was a declaration, a severing. Silas's face turned a mottled red. He saw her not as a person, but as property, a problem that was refusing to be solved. "You are my responsibility," he spat, his voice rising. "You will come with me now." He took a step forward. Kale also took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife. The message was unmistakable. But it was Alara who ended it. She looked her brother-in-law in the eye, the man who had left her for dead, and she felt nothing but a distant pity. He was the one who was trapped, bound by the small, mean rules of his world. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it was absolute. Final. It was a door slamming shut on a cold, empty room. "This is my home now. Go back to your town." Silas stood there, sputtering, impotent against her certainty. The sheriff, seeing the unyielding line of warriors and the absolute conviction in Alara's eyes, saw only trouble he did not want. He put a hand on Silas's arm. "Let's go, Silas," he muttered. "She's made her choice." They left, two small men on horseback, retreating from a world they could not comprehend. Their dust lifted behind them like angry ghosts and then vanished. Alara turned and walked back into the heart of the canyon. Kale fell into step beside her. They did not speak. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer about survival. It was about peace. That evening, she sat by a fire, stitching a tear in a child's moccasin with an awl and sinew. The leather was soft and worn. The house no longer felt hollow, the land no longer haunted. The camp breathed around her, a living thing made of families and stories and shared work. The house she had lost was just wood and nails. This place, this workia, was a home. Kale sat across the fire from her, carving again. He was adding to the piece of wood he had started in the ravine. To the hawk and the flower, he was carving the shape of a rock overhang, a shelter, a beginning. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. He smiled, a small, rare thing that transformed his face. She smiled back. She was no longer Ilara, the widow. She was Izinadai, mother of peace. She had been given nothing, and so she had found everything. She had been left to die, and so she had finally begun to live. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is about the fact that sometimes the only way to find out who you are is to be stripped of everything you were. It is about how the deepest kindness often comes not from those who have plenty, but from those who have nothing left to give but their own humanity. We all have a name someone else has given us, a wife, a worker, a failure, a son. But the real names, the ones that matter, are the ones we earn when we stand in front of something we love and refuse to move. The names we are given when we shield another soul from the cold. So here is your naming, whispered on the wind from a high canyon. You are what you protect. You are what you refuse to abandon. And if you are brave enough to stand in the path of a rifle for the sake of a stranger's heartbeat, you might just find that you have built a home in the one place you never thought to look. You might just find that you have become a shield. And a shield, you see, is just another word for a heart that has found its purpose.